All right, we are live. Welcome back to the People and Culture Essentials videocast, brought to you, of course, by the People and Culture Association or the PCA. I'm Jonathan. I'm going to be a host today, and of course, the coordinator for the People and Culture Association. Once again, if you are joining us live on YouTube or LinkedIn, welcome to these videocasts that we do almost every Friday now. For those of you who are not yet acquainted with the People and Culture Association, it's a vibrant and fast growing global community of people professionals. And the PCA's purpose, of course, is to promote a purpose driven, value based, and person centered workplace culture. Now, the People and Culture Association brings together HR professionals, culture change practitioners, business leaders, HR practitioners, mediators, restorative justice practitioners, facilitators, academics, students, coaches, say anyone who's involved in creating anyone who's involved in creating a better workplace. They're all part of us, and we of course provide two different kinds of memberships. You can join us individually, or you can sign up your organization to be a part of our corporate partner membership. And of course, one of our most liked events that we do live is the People and Culture Essentials videocast. Joining today on this videocast, of course, are two very wonderful sapiens. That's what I'm going to call them today, who are going to be nerding over people and culture. I'm going to get straight to it and introduce you to Luke Omani. We just realized how to pronounce his name right, so we're going to keep saying that today as much as we can. Luke Omani, and thank you for joining us, Luke. Of course, Luke's the founder of SapienX. He's a people and culture nerd, as we all know, and he, of course, likes to talk about people ops, leadership, design thinking, and people experience. And joining him on today's call, of course, as always, is a very gracious host, David Liddle, who is the CEO and chief consultant of the TCM Group, the president of the PCA, of course, and the founder of peopleandculture.com, who's very busy writing his new book on people and culture. So I'm going to pop back, gents, and let you two nerds get on with people and culture. I'll be backstage. The stage is all yours.
Brilliant! What a great, what a fantastic introduction, Jonathan. Thank you so much, Luke. Fantastic! Welcome to today's People and Culture Essentials videocast.
No, total pleasure. I've really enjoyed already the backstage sort of preparation for this. It's been really good fun chatting behind the scenes. So, looking forward to getting into it, David. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, really looking forward to today's call. I think anyone who says some of the things that you've been saying for on LinkedIn and elsewhere, I think is for me is really exciting. Traditional HR is outdated, restrictive, and reactive. You say it's time to usher in the new era of people experience design and to evolve the very fabric of HR. And really, that's very much what we're trying to do at the People and Culture Association: is generate a discourse, a dialogue about traditional HR systems and processes, which I know you've got a lot of thoughts and spoken about and written about widely, Luke, and really thinking about how do we do people, how do we do culture, how do we do purpose and values and organizations and drive successful organizations for the future. And really, that's why I'm so excited about today's conversation, Luke. And thank you again for joining us and just being part and contributing, as you have been, to this amazing conversation about the very future, the very essence of what it means to be a people professional in our organizations.
No, it's a total privilege to be here, and it's a total privilege to be actually in people and culture and HR right now, because I think we're about to, and we're starting one of the most significant transformations of how we view people within an organization and how we deliver services, solutions, and products to those people. I think it's probably one of the most exciting times to be in the people profession. So it's just a privilege to be part of that conversation and part of the evolution.
Amazing. I think we're going to have such good exploration of that. And what does that mean? And what is the potential future? And I guess to an extent, what are the opportunities that present themselves? But to another question is, what does HR need to let go of in order to be able to embrace these opportunities? And it may have been some radical rethinking. So got some great questions, a great conversation, I think, planned ahead. But Luke, just for colleagues on the call and on today's People and Culture Essentials videocast, perhaps who aren't familiar with your work, could you tell us a little bit more about you and your journey so far into the space of HR and people and culture?
Definitely, yeah. So It all started for me actually, although I didn't know it at the time. So I was one of the lucky people that did a degree at university that actually was useful, which isn't always the case.
Yeah.
But it was quite accidental. So I chose pragmatically what was called management because it sounded sensible. Like that will lead to a job. Let's do that.
Yeah.
Happily, I experienced something that was not a traditional management course, and there was actually only 11 of us that were doing my specific degree, and it was quite experimental.
Okay.
A lot of organizational design, a lot of psychology, sociology, philosophy. Exploring people dynamics in as individuals, as groups, even stuff like actor network theory, which is this exploration of how humans are actors and how we interact with physical and non-physical agents, which
Mhm.
starts to orient our behaviors. So many cool concepts and deconstruction and storytelling, and how do we
Mm.
apply that in an organizational context. So I was so lucky because that's not what I signed up for, but it was so cool and laid a lot of the foundations and nerdy roots and threads that I've then since pulled. But after university, I went into a career in recruitment, which was I thought it was heavily people focused, but I found that it wasn't as
Mm.
people focused as I like. Because I found myself in the agency side of recruitment to start with, which is obviously very sales driven traditionally. I know that's changing. There's some awesome recruiters and agencies out there, so certainly not indicative of the whole industry.
Mm.
But I found myself in quite a transactional sales sort of recruitment environment and culture, and also didn't enjoy a lot of the culture, base culture in recruitment per se. But cutting a long story short, I spent about 6 years in recruitment in various capacities, and then managed to sidestep into solution design with RPO. So that was
Yeah.
holistic talent solutions. So tech stack, on and off site sourcing teams, employer value proposition, and an employer brand. And this is where I started to pull in some of
Mm.
those university threads again. And then the real leap for me was part of that role. I was spending immersed in the progressive HR and people community. So at the time, and still is, a shout out to Perry Timms. I don't know if you know Perry David.
I know Perry too. Yeah, he's been one of our guests. We know Perry very well at the PCA. Great advocate for
So
progressive HR practices.
he's a big reason why you and I are having this conversation, in the sense that it was about 8 years ago that he and I sat down for a coffee in St Pancras Station, and I spoke to him about what I wanted to achieve and what I wanted to change in the world of work. And he was obviously just getting going with PTHR, which is now this fabulous organization of change in the people and HR space. So I found myself immersed and surrounded and connected to these awesome people doing really cool stuff. I was like, I've got to be doing that. What am I doing over here? I've got to be on that side. So I
Love
managed
it.
to tee up an opportunity to join a startup in their second year, and ultimately that role led me to become the head of people and operations, and I spent sort of 3 years fully immersed in startup land, building and scaling a startup from the inside, and that is what led me on to more hands-on culture design work, starting with getting a little bit frustrated with traditional HR practices that were sort of being encouraged upon me, or that's what I could find when I was looking for answers,
Mm.
and really then started to experiment, because I was looking after product, I was looking after marketing, I was looking after ops and people. So I was looking after all these different departments. And so I started just to pull in things that were working well in each of those, and started to experiment them more specifically in the people and culture space, which is really the origins of where we've got to. And then just quickly bring this up to speed. So having left the startup world, what I am now focused on with Sapien X is essentially creating frameworks, products, information, tools, content that allows the next generation of people leaders to adopt these new ways of thinking and new ways of working that get us to transform the way in which we deliver HR to our people. And in my sort of grandiose vision, I think we can change work, society, and the world in that order, because
Mhm.
work is our biggest touch point often it's where we can make the biggest impact on someone's life most often. And so if we can get that bit right and create the conditions for people to thrive in work, it's likely that they'll start to thrive outside of work too, in their relationships. And then beyond that, the compound effect is that potentially we can then have a ripple out to touch the reaches of the world. But that's a grandiose vision, but you got to have one, right?
100%. I mean, and to an extent, it has to start somewhere with that vision. But to an extent, it's grandiose. But to another extent, it's about people, isn't it? And people, we are citizens. People, we are employees. People, we are colleagues. We are managers. We're leaders. We're parents. So we hold so many different roles in our lives. So to an extent, the connections that you're building between work and society more generally in the world at large, and you're kind of bringing in, the climate change agenda as well. I was sitting there sort of seeing the hottest June on record globally, the impact that we all have in terms of some of the sustainability and climate change agenda as well. So grandiose maybe, Luke, but at the same time, we need big thinkers out there thinking big about how do we begin to connect the dots. And I think people and culture provide the basis for us to start connecting those dots. And I'm looking forward to digging into this. And it really resonates, your story, with me personally and professionally, but also it resonates in terms of the view of HR, very heavy on process and systems, and I think shifting away from policy, process and procedure to a greater focus on people. And I'm really looking forward to exploring that with you, because I often see, and I've spoken about many events, I see built into those systems is retribution and blame. And actually within an HR function, and many of the management systems in our organizations, actually the very core of what's wrong with many of those systems is that it requires someone to be at fault and to be an identifiable wrongdoer in that system in order for there to be some kind of culpability and blame. And it's the retributive nature of many of those systems which I think go to the heart of why many of them don't work and drive dysfunction. So you're doing something actively about it. What a great story. And we've got a shared friend there with Perry Timms, who's just been inducted into the Hall of Fame with HR Magazine's most influential thinkers. So congratulations, Perry, from all of us at the People and Culture Association for that amazing accolade. But let's jump into Sapien X. What a brilliant brand name. It's fantastic. And perhaps you can tell us a little bit more about the inspiration behind Sapien X. Interested to know what the X means as well, Luke, and tell us just a little bit more about the vision. What's the sort of thinking behind the brand?
Absolutely, yeah. So Sapien X is, first of all, it's a good representation of part of my personality, which is quite nerdy, right? So it sounds a little bit potentially scientific, which I like, because that kind of taps into me, really. Like I'm quite nerdy. But the Sapien X, of course, Sapien being the representation of the people, the human element. So Sapien, and then the X really is twofold. It acts as a multiplier. So you'll see the way I use it is as a superscript. So it's always slightly above the Sapien word, in the same way as you'd use it in mathematics. So it acts as a multiplier. So we've got this idea of multiplying human potential, right? So that's part of the core. And then the other part, of course, is Sapien X, a human experience, people experience. So it kind of brings those two things together. So multiplying human potential through, for me, intentional people experience design. And that's the link there.
That's really clever, isn't it? I mean, that's really great the way that you managed to bring those two elements together. So, for me, the human experience, you've talked about optimizing it, is often diminished when we go through some of the HR systems and processes perhaps that we know. So the ones I kind of thinking about here, Luke, are disciplinary and grievance and performance management and absence, and some of those people policies also. They're the opposite of Sapien X. I don't know what mathematically what the opposite of that would be, probably a negative side of it. How's Sapien X challenging HR, and what kind of work are you seeing, and what are you doing in helping to bring that people experience to life, that Sapien experience to life in an environment of optimization and flourishing, when I don't think that's necessarily the felt experience of a great many people when they perhaps encounter some of those kind of classic or traditional systems and processes that we've seen evolving over the last 20, 30, 40 years?
So I think the main place to start is with why it's important semantically to move away from HR.
Right.
Because I think it's really important that we don't fall into the trap of saying HR is bad, full stop, because that's not what you and I'm speaking for you a little bit, but that's not what you and I are saying, as far as I can say.
Absolutely right.
So it's really important that we start with the semantics and why it's important semantically to move away from HR. So human resources as a phrase is already quite reductive in the sense that it categorizes people as a resource in a very literal sense, which already suggests that the very nature of its orientation is to control and distribute and regulate and manage rather than enable, let's say, because enablement is a key word for me. So, and with that association of human resources as that controlling regulatory function, and as humans as a resource to be managed, there's several decades worth of connotations now attached to that mantle of HR. And so we'll all have seen it in various times in our career or roles where we're maybe called the fun police, or you get given these sort of mantles as soon as people know that you're in HR. Like at a dinner party, someone might like recoil in their chair, like, oh, HR's here. Everyone, start behaving. And there's this sort of like unhelpful connotation attached. It goes deeper than that, but let's just stay with a playful anecdotal version. But there's a real, people get put off by the idea of HR. So then when you're in a HR function within a business and you're trying to drive meaningful change and impact, as a lot of amazing HR professionals are doing, you're doing it under the umbrella of HR, which is, whether you know it or not, is restricting your ability to have impact, because people start to maybe treat you differently, i.e. fearfully, a little bit fearful of HR, or they don't take you seriously as a strategic commercial function because they see you as this regulator, policer, controller. So semantically, I think that's why it's important that we move away from HR and start to think about people experience and culture as the focus of our work, because that then becomes the real driver and enabler of change. And of course, we can get into some more specifics around my advocation in terms of approach and strategy on how to do that. But that's really, I think, important to caveat or get in at the start of the conversation, that it's as much to do about PR for HR as it is about HR is no longer fit for purpose.
So a couple of questions that come to my mind as you speak, because I completely agree with absolutely everything that you're saying. I suppose the first one is going back to the sort of notion of we're all actors in our, I think going back to the management program that you're running. So HR might say to us, look, but there are bad actors in our organization. So great to be an enabler function, but we need to have this regulation. We need to be able to have this reductive approach. Reduction is a 50 balance of probability and all that kind of stuff, as well as the language being reductive. Because we have bad actors, and our job is to protect the organization from the risk of the bad actors. What do you say to those HR directors who are resistant to change, Luke, because the systems are designed to reduce the risk and to mitigate the impact of bad actors in our organizations, and the enabling function gets pushed aside to the risk mitigation, which is a big driver for many in HR, I think?
I think the first thing would be, that would tell me a lot about that person's mindset and how they see themselves and their role. If that is the mindset that they're in, it's really important that they keep those things in place in case someone does anything bad. Because the reality is, and we need to get to grips with, again, changing how we, let's say, just say how we as a HR function view our employees. Like they're not there for us. We're not there to police them. Like, as long as we're still in that mindset that we're there to police and prevent misbehavior, we're already restricting our impact immediately. So there's a mindset issue there. And then practically, to address that, I'll share with the audience the same advice that I got when I was kind of asking the same question as a first-time head of people. I was lucky enough to have a few mentors around me. And so I called one of them, Kim Randers. I don't know if anyone knows Kim, or David would be a great guest to have on. But Kim Randers, he's now the global director of people at Service Express. And I called him. I said, Kim, I'm just finding myself spending all of my time dealing with misbehavior and running through processes, because again, naive and new to the role as a first-time head of people, I was trying to follow the letter of the law, like by the HR policy handbook, because I thought that's what my job was when I first landed in that role. And he kind of laughed at me in a friendly way and said, yeah, been there, kind of thing. But remember, Luke, policies generally, or 99% of the policies that we have in place are to address a 1% misbehavior. So you'd be much better spending your time focusing on the 99% of your people who aren't misbehaving. Let's just categorize it as that, but who aren't causing any issues. So you're spending 99% of your energy essentially focusing on dealing with 1% of people that are causing problems, when you could be spending 99% of your time focused on enabling and empowering performance, engagement, and all of the great things that we could be doing with that time. So that's where the penny dropped for me. And I was like, yeah, well, 100%. I'm now gonna, and this is where I started to roll out internally at the time, what I had framed, because I didn't have anything else to call it, decentralized HR. So what was happening at that point is that all the other department heads were coming to me with all of their issues, etc. And because it's what I knew when I started the role, we were then going into processes that were taking time and energy and effort away from good stuff. So I stopped that then. I was like, right, we're not doing that anymore. I said, the approach now is a decentralized HR approach. And what I mean by that is that we're going to avoid formal process as often as possible. So now our default is to reach informal resolution, and only when informal resolution hasn't worked will we look to escalate. And obviously that like dramatically, cut the amount of formal processes that were happening, because actually me spending the time enabling department heads to have better conversations, to develop their ability to mitigate, to go into your world, to coach, to develop, to problem solve. It just completely dramatically, like almost overnight, changed and gave me all that time back that I was wasting on processes and enforcing policy. It gave all of the leaders back time that were also having to be involved in that. The ripple effect was enormous. So that's what I would say there, is that don't forget that, to quote Kim again, 99% of policies are in place to address 1% misbehavior. So don't get drawn into the trap of trying to enforce those policies rigidly.
I mean, so many people, I'm sure, are listening to today's People and Culture Essentials videocast and nodding furiously, listening to you speak and saying this makes perfect sense. It's common sense. It makes an awful lot of sense to focus on that 90%, the enabling, optimization, empowerment. That's why I went into HR in the first place. This is why I became an HR professional. And what I hear people often say in HR is it's not our responsibility. This is coming from the board. The chief executive officer, the COO, CFO, and others are putting pressure on the HR function to be the function which is about risk mitigation and risk aversion. It's not promoting and encouraging HR to take on and to adopt the mantle of an empowering, optimization, enabling function. And so there's this sort of blame game that we see playing out in organizations when we're starting to think about trying to drive the shift, which is what responsibility do our boards play in helping to shape the space whereby the HR function can focus on the 99%, not to ignore the 1%, Luke, but to recognize the 99%. Have you had an experience of supporting CPOs and others in HR in terms of developing their relationship with their board, where it's working in tandem and there's a deeper understanding of the role of the people and culture function, people experience within the workplace in a way which is supported by the board, who I think sometimes, and this is a personal view, don't necessarily get HR or don't get modern HR. Curious to know your thoughts about the relationship with ExCo on this debate.
Well, the it goes back to that semantic issue that we started with. So most people on boards will be familiar with the traditional version of HR. So when, let's say, the founding team come and say, right, we're gonna hire a head of people, that comes with a degree of expectation. So there's two things. There's one is that as the head of people or head of HR, however we're titling it, going in,
Yeah.
it's really important that you spend the time when you join communicating to the SLT and wider business who you are and what you're there to do. Because if you don't do that, then people will assume that you are a HR function and they will
Yeah.
attach their associations to HR to you and they will treat you that way. And so, and again, this isn't anything intentional. It's just a subconscious, oh, we've got a HR person now. That's the person to go
Yeah.
to if we've got a problem, or that's the person that we need to be
Yeah.
careful around. So it's really important that you spend that time, particularly any first time heads of people, first time HR leaders listening to this, or spend that time. And before you do that, make sure you understand what you're there to do too, right? So make sure that
Absolutely.
you thought about that. What is your philosophy that you're bringing to this company, to this organization, and how are you going to communicate that philosophy and garner support for that philosophy, and make sure that that philosophy aligns with the business objectives and strategic objectives of the organization? Because remember, and we can get onto it in a minute because we're starting to move in that direction, that
Yeah.
you know our people within an organization are our customers, but we have multiple customer groups, and certainly one of those is the board, um, and or the business. If we just categorize them as the business, their
Yeah.
needs are valid, right? So you also can't just ignore
Yeah.
their needs and expectations, but that communicating, understanding your own philosophy on people and culture and what you're there to do, and aligning that with the needs and objectives of the board and the organization is critical. Because then when you do that, if you spend the first 12 weeks really meeting people, communicating, understanding their needs, so the wider SLT, the board, and then explaining to them how your philosophy can enable and support them to achieve those objectives, you're starting from a very different place. And you'll probably be met with shock and awe, like, whoa, we didn't understand that HR could do these things. Like, yeah, we're here to help. Like, we're here to enable, we're here to drive growth as much as the product team and the marketing team and the sales team. We're here to grow this business through growing its people, right? And that's really the essence of it. I think that's my main bit of advice. Spend that time building the relationships and communicating your philosophy and how that will benefit the organization.
See, what I think you're saying in a nutshell, if I'm hearing this right, Luke, is HR are not passive recipients of instruction from the board.
Right.
It's a direct and ongoing conversation and dialogue between the people function, senior leadership team, as one of the key stakeholders in the decision-making process, where HR and the people function can begin to shape the thinking within the organization in relation to the needs and goals and aspirations they have around optimization, empowerment, enabling of people.
Right.
And it's not that HR are passive in this linear decision-making process and we're looking up and then receiving the instruction down. There's a bigger conversation, and I think you're talking there about how we see that. And one of the areas I've been reading about when I was thinking about today, I kind of you've touched on this already, and you're already breaking down some barriers in the language you're using. You're using language of customer experience. You're using language of product management and product development in the way you're thinking about shaping the people function. Could you talk a little bit more about some of that language and what it means to you, and why you think it is valuable for us to start thinking about employees as customers, why you're starting to think about some of these areas as products and these groups as stakeholders? Just very different language than perhaps we're used to in the HR space. Curious to dig into that a bit if we can, Luke.
It's a really important shift, because exactly as you described, I think HR have been treated as a linear, they are enforcers and instruction followers, etc., etc.,
Mm-hmm.
which has been the case for many years. It's the role it's played. It's changing now. Admittedly, I spend a lot of time in startup, scale up, more sort of, I guess, progressive environments already. So I think that's where the change is starting, because of course it's quite difficult to change the direction of the Titanic whereas you can change the direction of a speedboat quite quickly, right? So there is this caveat that these principles, it's going to take a while to scale them into larger organizations, or of course the big tech companies are doing a good job already because they're familiar with the vernacular and the ways of working, so their people functions are probably a little bit ahead. But yeah, to come back to it, so for me, I started to think about the employees as customers, and what we were doing within the people function as creating product for those for those customers as the employees. So that was the initial shift, and that came for me when I was frustrated in that first time head of people role with traditional practices, and started to explore other ways of working that looked to me to be more appropriate, and that led me my gateway drug, if you like, into the world of product and applying that to people was The Lean Startup by Eric Ries, which I think is a fairly well-known book, but if you've not heard of it, then it's a great book to get you started with this mindset shift. And sort of at the center of that is the lean startup philosophy, or lean startup principle, which essentially, to boil it down to its bare bones, is build, measure, and iterate. Essentially, you know, build, test, measure, build, test, measure, and you go into these loops that then allow you to make smaller changes more quickly, but based on real-time information. So that's the origin. It's like, how do we take that concept of building something as a product, delivering that to our end customers, in this case our employees, collecting feedback on how they are using it and whether or not it is appropriate and fit, and addressing the needs, and then iterating over time to improve that product. Or if it isn't right and relevant, then rather than committing to a big lengthy project, which happens so often in HR, like we're going to do a 12-month HRIS system project, whatever it might be, like some really enormous project, when actually it might not, if we actually went and spoke to the end user, we might find that it's not what they want or need, and actually there's something else we could do. So this is the origins, right? So it's like, okay, let's not now assume that our role is to tell people what it is and isn't right for them as employees. Let's engage them in the conversation as we would a customer. So that's like the origins. And then my nerdy brain continues to run on that thread. We've got this idea of the scientific inquiry, which I shared in my newsletter this week, actually, because I was watching Spider-Man with my son, and Peter Parker went to the Oscorp lab, and he was so excited by the scientists doing their work, and someone was giving them a tour and was about to explain the scientific inquiry process, and Peter Parker shouted out, and couldn't help but, because he's such a nerd like me, and I am trying to tell everyone that I am Spider-Man. That's what I'm really getting at here. But we've got this idea of the scientific inquiry, right? So observe, question, carry out research, create a hypothesis, experiment, and then analyze the results and draw conclusions. So that starts to feed in, okay? We can start to think more scientifically and more data-led. So how can we start to bring more data into the decisions we're making in a people function about the direction that we're building products? And then linked to that, we've got UX design. So you can see all of these things starting to layer up, all saying the same thing. So UX design is about empathize first. So understand the end user and their needs and the challenges, define the problem, then ideate on some possible solutions, create a prototype and test it. So again, we're seeing the same patterns of thinking and behavior in lean startup, in the scientific inquiry, in UX design. And then of course, finally in itself, you've got agile, which of course Perry is a big advocate for, and agile HR is something that over the last decade has been creeping in. But then you've got the agile's like the final stage, which is where you've got this iterative process, and being able to bring all those together. So design thinking, lean startup, agile in a single strategy. That means that you're starting by collecting data or making observation, i.e. we think our employees need or want X, or let's go and ask some questions, let's gather some research, let's then go through that process that ultimately gets us to creating a prototype that we can give to those employees to test and measure and iterate and develop over time. So that's kind of at the heart of this whole process. It's data driven, it's UX focused, it's iterative by design, and it allows you to be a lot more responsive as a people function, because you'll remember the data that you're collecting is obviously employee needs, but also business needs, right? And
Yeah.
your job is to then bridge the gap of that, and how you could bring those two together. So how do you design products in your people function that address the needs of the business and employees in equal measure? So that's kind of the essence of it. If I just take one more jump before I
Yes.
pause.
No, of course, please do.
So Jessica Swan has recently released a fabulous book called Built for People, right?
I've got it here.
So good. And the
Yes.
connection that she made in one of the early chapters, which then for me was like a big penny drop moment, because it is how I've been thinking, but she made this bridge from people ops as a product to people ops as a subscription product.
Yeah.
And this is where things started to just drop into place for me, because that's absolutely it. Because with any subscription, obviously it's your job is to ensure the renewal of that subscription, and Jess talks about how every month that an employee chooses to stay in your organization, they're actually renewing their subscription. So your job, essentially, when we talk about people ops or people experience as a product, is actually how do we create a subscription product based on continuous and increasing value that keeps people engaged and subscribing in our people experience over a longer period of time. And that's really the essence of it. And I've made a leap from that onto the flywheel approach, which we can come back to, but I'll just pause there for a second because it's a lot to take in.
There is a lot to take in, but it's a really interesting iteration and development of the thinking of the way that we're connecting with, working with, optimizing the relationship with our people in our organizations. And there's also a slow and gradual shift away from sort of, not necessarily just in the people function, a shift away from the sort of command and control autocratic management and leadership structure towards this more transformational approach driven by those lean methodologies, those agile methodologies, and those sort of product and customer experience. And we've had, hopefully I pronounced the name correctly, Priyanka. Priyanka has asked us a question. I want to kind of ask it because it's a really important question. And it's something I was wanting to pick up with you as well. So Priyanka's asked, again, forgive me, Priyanka, if I've not got that right, but how can the HR team in an organization work with functional heads to focus on enable, and can I just kind of provide a platform for that question as well? If in the agile methodology that you've talked about, one of the principles in there is to fail fast. There's constant experimentation and high failure rate in order to be able to grow and innovate and gather the insight that takes us into the next iteration of the development. Fast-paced, agile approach, massive fan of that. But organizations are really bad at handling failure. And particularly within HR functions, we have a policy and process for virtually every failure you could imagine. And most of them are based on someone's at fault, and you used the term reductive earlier, try to reduce it to right, wrong, and black and white outcomes. And obviously it's not. And the real, for me, the real touch point here, the lightning rod for this issue is in performance management conversations. So the question I had really, and the work that you've been doing at Sapien X, is to think a little bit more about how have you been helping HR, and how could HR transform some of those performance conversations to reevaluate our attitude to failure, to lean into Priyanka's question, which is that the role that our people profession can support functional managers and leaders in order to be able to create that space. So it's taken what you've said and just trying to build it into that performance ecosystem a bit, Luke, to help illustrate the point for us, if that's possible.
Yes. So a few different threads there that I'll try and address.
Yeah, there's a few threads. Apologies if it was a bit confusing, but hopefully that's okay.
No, all good. Where should we go first? Let's address the failure piece first, right? So, of course, it comes down to culture, and again, we could get super nerdy on how we define and describe culture, but let's just say it's a cultural issue, right? So we need to address that culturally. So from a mindset and behavioral approach, and some of that comes with defining what failure is, and I think that's where you start. right? So if you just take the word failure, first of all, immediately it's negative connotations. Right? You can't help but think negatively about failure. So it's really important that if we're going to talk about failing fast or having a high tolerance of failure, we start to define what that means in our organization. And I split that down into what are we categorizing as competent failure, which is failure that leads to learning. And what are we categorizing as incompetent failure, which is repeated failings of the same thing and a pattern of behavior that isn't leading to a development of sorts, right? So I think, again, that's being a little bit reductive, but just to simplify it, I think it's important that however you do that, to define what good failure looks like versus what negative failure looks like, because you can't treat them both the same. So that's the first thing. Failure can't be a single concept. It needs to be split out into a net positive and a net negative. So then you can treat each accordingly. So that's the first thing I would say on the failure piece. And then in terms of addressing the Priyanka's question around engaging business heads on enablement, first of all, I think it's very important that, again, if we're going to take this, the approach that I've outlined is that the first port of call is to go and speak with those heads and try and understand what it is that they're trying to achieve and what does enablement mean to them. So it's really about engaging in the conversation and then working with them to create a prototype for enablement within their function. I've got a framework for enablement that I think is useful, which is five. I call it the 5 S's of enablement. So you've got support, structure, services, systems, and sensation. So sensation is a bit of an odd addition just because it worked from an alliteration perspective. But when I talk about sensation, what I'm talking about is experience, the feel, right? So what is the experience and the feel that we want to create? And then the other areas of enablement are more OD focused in terms of, so structure. How do we distribute work and people effectively? So that's a key part of enablement. So how do we understand people's strengths and make sure they're aligned to work that optimizes for those strengths? And where and when and how do we work? All of these things fit into structure. Systems, tech, and tools. So what do our people have the right systems, operating systems, technical platforms, whatever it is that they need to do their roles? Do they have that? We've got support. So do our people have the right level of performance development? Do they have the right access to training? Do they have the structure around them that allows them to grow and develop and evolve? Do they have access to me as a leader when they need me? Do we have a regular cadence for meetings, one-to-ones, course correction, alignment? And then the final bit is services. So what internal services do our people need? So whether that's access to EAP on a more practical sense, or whether that's putting on our customer hat again and saying, what would we have in place as a customer support function for our people to optimize their experience and to make sure that they can optimally perform in their role and take the most out of this people experience as a product, to draw the analogy again. But you've got those areas: support, structure, systems, services, and then that experience piece in sensation, and using that framework to have a conversation with the different heads about what are your requirements in each of these areas, and building something that is relevant and specific to the department to enable that, rather than saying, right, enablement for the business looks like this, because actually that's not going to work for everyone, because different teams will have different ways of working and different needs and requirements. So hopefully that addresses the question in some way.
I think you did. I mean, given that there was about 10 different elements to the question, I think you've done a fantastic job of addressing. You addressed that big F word of failure. And Priyanka, I hope you enjoyed listening to Luke's fantastic summary there of providing that support to around enablement to our heads. I'm really excited to hear about the 5 S's model that you were describing there, Luke. And you're listening to Luke Omani from Sapien X talking today about his experience, his expertise, his wisdom gathered over many years around a whole array of different aspects around the people and culture space. So this is the People and Culture Essentials Videocast, brought to you from the PCA. And if you have any questions for Luke, please do feel free to ask them today. Thank you for tuning in, or if you're listening to this on demand, thank you very much for downloading today's People and Culture Essentials podcast. So I'm David Liddle. I'm the president of the People and Culture Association, and I'm really we do a lot of work, Luke, at TCM and with my colleagues, working with organisations, breaking down some of the barriers around culture. And sometimes the first time that we get to work with an organisation is when they've had what we call culture shock. I guess in wider terms is described as a toxic culture. They bring people like us to try and help address some of the issues that gave rise to the toxic culture. And one of the changes that I think we see, and the culture shifts that we see in organizations, relates to leadership and a recognition that actually the leader plays a critical role in shaping the organization culture. And you talked earlier about the sort of speedboat versus the oil tanker Titanic dynamic. I often talk about shifting culture through delivering compassion at scale. So we can be the motorboat. If everyone was just a little bit kinder to each other today, which we chose to do, then actually, if we did that at a scale, then that can create a happier workforce, which then can create increased discretionary effort, and that can actually start to see the culture shift. We don't have to wait for years to turn the oil tanker around. We can deliver cultural change by delivering compassion at scale. But it requires a sort of new thinking around the concept of leadership, and leadership and people and culture become key partners in driving the shift. Just curious to know from your perspective, what does sort of leadership mean to you, and what do you see as sort of the emerging trends in leadership through the work that you're doing at Sapien X?
Well, I think you're right. First and foremost, that you can't drive any sort of cultural change without having the buy-in and support of the leadership team more broadly, whatever that leadership structure looks like in your organization. Certainly the most senior levels of leadership needs to be 100% bought in to whatever it is, however you're defining it. It needs to come from leadership. It can't be something that's driven purely by the CEO, let's just say, where they say, right, we're going to change in this direction, off we go. And it can't be driven, let's say, by HR and say culture isn't working, or culture isn't right, culture is toxic, so now this is the new culture, we've done a fancy branding exercise and here it is, here's your new culture. It can't be that. Like, there's elements
if
of
only
that.
It was that simple, Luke. If only it was that simple, but I think we would all accept it's a long way from that.
It's a long way from that. And of course, that marketing piece plays its role, by the way. It's not diminishing that, but we can't just create a new set of values and put them on the wall and expect that to change everything. So part of it is how do we operationalize that? But coming back to your question around leadership. So for me, I think there needs to be within your organization, you need to agree what a leader is. So have a set of principles around leadership, like this is what a leader is and this is the role of leaders. And you might also want to split that out from the role of a manager, let's say. Whilst of course a management role is a leadership position, you might be expecting different things of different people, and leaders might take on a different set of responsibilities versus managers. So again, for me, it doesn't really matter how you define it, as long as you have defined it, because at least then that sets expectation and alignment. And more like on a meta level, I think we have to learn to default to trust, and that's really at the heart of it. Like, if we are cynical, let's just say if we're cynically minded and we assume that people are going to take advantage, that's a pretty negative way to come into a leadership or management position. Yet it is quite often the default. Like, we must over-regulate because we're fearful of what might happen if we're not on top. So defaulting to trust is a big one, I think. So and that requires a mindset shift. And then, like, in terms of the traits of a modern leader, I think honest, human, compassionate, as you say, and compassion for me is a really big one, because I'm a subscriber to the radical candor model of
Mhm.
communication. But of course, radical candor can be misinterpreted. And even though if you look at the model, it's predicated on compassion and care.
Yeah.
If you just take it in isolation, you can perhaps be a bit too forceful with your articulation of that. Or so what's crucial about compassion is it actually enables candor and candid conversations, because if you actually care, then it's really important that you have the difficult conversations, because it's at the benefit of that individual and of you. And so the compassion as an enabler for difficult conversations becomes really important. And then the other bit for me is accountability, which links back to trust. So I think for me, I want to be held accountable. So if I was reporting into you, David, I would want you to hold me accountable. I actually have like pride and dignity in my work. And so if I'm not delivering in that, I want to know. Like I want to know. I want you to address that with me. And I don't want you to wait until we get to a formal performance review for you to call me
Absolutely.
out on things that you could have just spoken to me about, that I would have thanked you for bringing to my attention. And it's a two-way accountability piece, because I think modern leaders need to be not only accepting of upward criticism, but invite it. Like, I want feedback from you. How am I performing as a leader? What do you need from me? So I think there's this two-way
Yeah.
accountability piece that I think is a function of modern leadership.
Amazing. An incumbent on them as the leader is the ability to listen, and to
Hmm.
listen actively and respond to that and receive that information as a gift, as feedback always is. And then be able to respond non-defensively and to react and respond, or to respond rather than to react to that information. Kind of ties into a question Vitali Diakov has asked us. Vitali, very warm welcome to the webinar today. You've asked, really enjoying it. Thank you for the amazing event. My question, and I think it might tie into some of the experiences that you had in those early days in recruitment as well, Luke. My question is how ways of communicating between people have changed, and what's a more effective way, certainly in terms of the recruitment process, for people to be able to secure a new employment. And he's talking about his experience of being part of a Ukrainian community that came after the war began. He found that word of mouth is the best way to secure a new job or develop a business. Hoping the question fits into the conversation. If the question is about communication, dialogue, engagement, as I'm hearing it, I don't think it just fits into the question. It defines the conversation, Vitali. So don't worry about that. But Luke, I think the question there is about the power of communication and dialogue, and in this context around job search. But I guess we could go beyond that if you wanted to.
Yeah, I mean, it does take us off on a slight tangent, but a relevant one.
Yeah.
But yeah, absolutely. So in terms of like job seeking, I am a massive advocate for proactivity, and like it or not, hitting apply on a job now is like the bare minimum you can do as an applicant. And you've got to bear in mind that we're operating in one of the most competitive times and environments for talent more broadly. It's more difficult than ever, actually, to stand out as an applicant, because of the volume of people that are looking, because of the great resignation or big quit, however we're defining it. People having this, really, it's this actual existential realization really is at the heart of it, that has been triggered by a number of global events over the last few years, where people are now going, maybe I need to be in an environment that actually fosters my health and my well-being. Maybe I deserve to thrive a little bit more than I was before. Maybe it's time for me to go and be valued somewhere else. So you've got lots of people, lots of talent looking for roles. So to answer your question directly, Vitali, I think the more proactively you can communicate, the better. So here's my little structure for job hunting for anyone that wants it. So first of all, really get to know yourself. So do that self exploration. So as much as you know your skills and your competencies that you can bring, start to think really clearly about your values and your beliefs and what's important to you as an individual, and the types of organizations that you want to work with as a result. Then make yourself a list of all of the organizations that you want to work for, like that you would love to work for. What is it about them that's unique that you can then apply to your broader search? But make a list. Then go to the department that you want to work in and find the head of that department, connect with them, send them a message, start engaging with them. Have a look who else is in the team that's at the level that you want to apply for, start engaging with them and connecting with them and starting a conversation, and build this sort of web of influence in as many of those companies that you wish that you could be part of as possible. And then linked to that is communicate your value as openly as you can, and evidence your value as openly and often as you can. So it was a slight tangent, I think, David, because it's more of like a job searching, but
Yeah.
open, honest, proactive communication is at the heart of it for sure.
Yeah, no, I think that's brilliant. I mean, thank you so much for answering the question. It's like a slight tangent, but this is all part of this bigger piece, isn't it, around how we, I mean, this is part of the employee value proposition that you referenced earlier, the recruitment, the selection, even the job design, and those early conversations about how we find roles, onboarding, that whole employee experience. It all begins to fit together. And what I like about your answer there and the question, and just the whole thinking about this, is we're thinking beyond just sort of functional silos of activity and seeing the person, the whole person, throughout this journey. So no, thank you so much, Luke, for that. And another question, maybe it's a slight tangent, coffee. But the PX, the People Experience Espresso Hour podcast, which I must confess is a particularly exciting one from my perspective as a self-declared caffeine addict, but only before lunchtime, I hasten to add. You've generated some amazing conversations, so I'll be interested to know how you think we're doing here today. But you've generated some great conversations, and it's really well received, as you would expect from your audience. What's the motivation behind keeping those coffee beans brewing, Luke, from your perspective?
So do you know what? This actually links back to Vitali's question a little bit as well. I am increasingly an advocate of combine as many of your passions as you can into your life and your work, right? So there's two parts of this. One is that I absolutely love coffee. So I've always liked coffee, but I moved to this house with my wife and my family. We moved here, and there's a specialty coffee shop just round the corner. And as soon as I started going there regularly, I was like, okay, like my mind has been blown. So that's part of it. I really like specialty coffee, and I've gone down a rabbit hole. So part of it is how do I bring that and express that in my work and make that part of it. So that's why the espresso bit and why we always start with the playful. I always talk about the coffee that I'm drinking at the time, etc. In terms of like the actual culture, people experience piece, it's twofold. One, a big part of my driver is getting as much free and available content and resources out there into the hands and ears, in this case, of practitioners. So I want to platform as many people doing interesting, progressive, experimental things so that anyone listening can take those and start to practice and experiment within their own work. And then the other bit is kind of selfish. I talk about the podcast, it's like the most selfish thing I do, because for me, I get to have amazing conversations with really interesting people, and I learn from every single one of them. And so for me, it's just constantly topping up my bank and getting me to remain curious, right? Because part of the problem of, let's just say, thought leadership is that potentially you can start riding your own wave a little bit, and you're like, right, my way of thinking is the way of thinking, and that's what I'm going to communicate. Whereas actually the podcast helps me to constantly have my thinking challenged. So I love it. Like I take so much from it. So it combines my passion for coffee, it combines my passion for people experience and geeking out. I get to platform people and share that with the world, and I get to learn in the process. So for me, like all of my passions are like centered in that podcast. They all come together at once, which is very cool.
And it sounds great. I can imagine they're great fun. You described yourself earlier as the Spider-Man of the people experience world. But but it was really interesting. But that the spider senses were tingling away there. But you've described yourself many times in the conversation as a self-confessed sort of people and culture nerd. And your post, I mean, if anyone isn't following, please do follow Luke on LinkedIn. And I know Jonathan will put the link into your into your podcast and into LinkedIn, so people can find out more about the work you're doing, Luke, and follow you, just be part of the conversations that the really rich conversations that you're happening. And I hope that you'll join us in the People and Culture Association as well, and just be part of the stuff we're doing, because I think we're very closely aligned. And your posts are just simply brilliant. And your latest one on the flywheel effect and its relevance to people experiences is really an intriguing take on employee growth, retention, and advocacy. Do you want to just say a few more words about that, and then we'll begin sort of those lovely wrap-up questions that we have at the end of a session such as this?
Yeah, totally cool. And again, it kind of links back to Vitali's job-seeking question too. So the flywheel, let's just quickly break that down. So the flywheel concept was introduced by Jim Collins in a book called Good to Great, and essentially it works on this idea of the mechanical flywheel, right? So a huge mechanical wheel that turns and it transfers the energy, the kinetic energy that it generates through turning, into a rod, which then can disperse that kinetic energy. And basically, once you start the wheel turning, it becomes easier and easier to turn because of its own momentum, and the energy that it generates through turning compounds, and it becomes self-perpetuating. So when we apply that to the business world and the business strategy world, we have this idea of the virtuous loop cycle, where one beneficial act leads to another, and so on and so forth. So the practical example I gave recently from a non-PX perspective was the Amazon flywheel. So at the center of the Amazon flywheel is growth. So their aim is to grow. And so what they do is they focus on great customer experience, which then brings more traffic to their website, which then brings more sellers to their website. More sellers means more selection, which feeds back into better customer experience, and the wheel goes on. Where the flywheel sort of continues to build its momentum is that their strategy is that we're going to provide a low cost structure and lower prices, which means that more customers will come in, and they come in at that point of customer experience, and the loop goes on. So they've got this continuous growth loop, which no one can argue with, because look at what they've done from a online book retailer to where they are now, all built on this. I applied that. You can apply that theory to any aspect of your people experience. And I give an example recently of retention. So let's say at the heart of our flywheel is employee advocacy. And so what we're going to focus on now is creating amazing people experiences that delight, that give the opportunity for personal growth, which then lead for people to stay in the business longer, which then leads them into increasing and continuous value through people experience, and they stay in that loop. And this is where that subscription piece back. So linking this back
to Jessica's.
Exactly that. So that's that. And then obviously, because of that amazing people experience and the delight and the personal growth and retention and staying in that loop, they become advocates. So your employee advocates start to communicate externally. So, hey, I love my job, which then brings in an engaged talent pipeline of people looking at your organization thinking, well, that's an awesome place to work because of the social proof of the employee advocacy. So now you've got this flywheel where you've got an amazing people experience, creating amazing delight and growth and retention, creating employee advocacy, which brings talent to you who enter and experience that amazing people experience and stay with your business. So you get growth and retention through focusing in on people experience, and you create this employee advocacy flywheel. So that was a very quick rattle through of the concept.
It's amazing. It's really amazing. And I'm hearing you using some real important, powerful language drawing from customer experience as well, that you're building into that, the concept of delighting our people. But also I think it's drawing on some other aspects. I'm a massive fan of Good to Great myself as well, and the whole kind of flywheel principle. We're also using some sort of systems thinking tools in there as well. And I think what it helps us in the people and culture function, as we see people and culture emerging and developing and evolving, shifting away from a process called the sort of talent acquisition and retention policy to a much wider piece of thinking around how we create that ecosystem at the heart of it with the flywheel, creating that energy within it. It's a new way of thinking, a modern way of thinking, which I love hearing. But I also think it's probably, for me, and it's to the point, and it's to the stuff we were talking about at the beginning. I see this as being an opportunity for HR as it evolves into people and culture to become the most strategically important function in the organisation. And no longer is HR desperate to have a seat at the board. People and culture, it becomes the table that others are sat around. They're not desperate to be at the table; they become the table. And I think the way you've just described that so clearly is a construct that underpins that concept of this strategic importance and the value of the people function. And ultimately, you tapped into talent retention as being one of the strategic drivers to illustrate your point. It could have been any number of those, but these are big topics. So thank you for sharing that. And again, I would urge people to contact Luke and follow him and find out more about the stuff that we're talking about. Just a kind of thought, you've got a black belt in social selling. It sounds as terrifying as it is intriguing. Just in a nutshell, could you just tell us more? What is that all about?
So that actually goes right back to my time in recruitment and sort of business development sales. But it was actually the guys at Social Talent. I don't know if you've come across them, but Johnny Campbell and Vince O'Donoghue.
Okay.
Social Talent is basically, or was a training platform for recruitment professionals that taught them how to use social media and creating relationships and selling through social means. So that was what the original platform were, and then they created. We use Social Talent basically to train our recruiters and sourcing partners at Hudson RPO when I was there. And as the development, sales, and solutions team, we did their module that was around social selling. But it was this idea of selling through relationship building, right? So rather than trying to pitch someone a product or service, it's actually how do you, with intentionality and authenticity, build a relationship first. Essentially, is what that is. So it does sound a little bit scary, doesn't it? But it's nothing to do with kung fu kicking people into submission. It's very much about relationship building and focusing on that human-centered approach. Yeah.
I mean, people buy from people they trust, respect, and like. And I mean, if that's so, and it kind of that's what I see and understand social selling to be, then it's kind of it's definitely rather than pitching a product to someone based on features and benefit of advantage, which is what we see so much selling doing. Which I think again, and again, it's one of we could get into. I mean, product development, customer experience, sales techniques, marketing techniques. We've just generated a whole agenda for the next People and Culture Essentials videocast between ourselves, because each of these areas, I mean, sales is, to me, sales and marketing is a really interesting area which I think we could focus on more. But thank you for shedding. I'm not so worried now.
It's a real blast from the past, because it must be nearly 7 or 8 years ago that I did that. Wow. So it was a real nice. Maybe it was 6 or 7 years ago, but it was a nice callback for me when you mentioned that.
Well, it sounds as relevant as you said for your 100%. First degree. And it's when you look back and see all of these dots joining, isn't it? Just how relevant they are. So, is there anything that you're working on at the moment, Luke, that's particularly exciting or interesting you'd like to share with viewers of today's People and Culture Essentials videocast?
I think the most exciting thing for me at the moment is the next evolution, so version 3.0 of my PX design and culture enablement program. That's the next one will be in September. But essentially, I've just completely overhauled my cohort-based program for people leaders. So basically, it will now a lot of the things we discussed. So we're going to start with the mindset shift that we need. So what is the people experience of subscription? What are the things we need to know in terms of creating a strategy? Things like the flywheel. And then our tools, our core methods, so agile, design thinking, product management, etc. And then tools. So what do we need? So stuff like, Kanban, how do we create product maps? How do we sprint ideate effectively? How do we facilitate co-design? And then the next layer is all of the elements of what I call my people culture source code, which is purpose, enablement, ownership, personalization, love, and empathy. And then baking that into like really practical design workshops. So that's really exciting. And then beyond that, I'm also in the process of creating a suite of digital products. So some digital courses that will be available, and playbooks that will be available that share this way of thinking and way of working with people practitioners. So I'm basically just entering an 8-week development sprint myself to bring the digital assets to life. But the enablement, the next enablement program is in September, and I'm really looking forward to sharing 3.0 with those that come along and attend. So if you are interested, by the way, then feel free to reach out. There's still a few places on the cohort. So it's very exciting for me. I get very nerdy and super excited about sharing these principles. So anyone who wants to come along and join in, then please do.
And hopefully you'll come back after the sessions run in September. I guess it may run for some time, but once it's concluded, please do come back, Luke, and let us know how it's gone. We'd love to hear more and learn more about that, because I think it sounds fantastically interesting, and it's bringing in capabilities into the space, which I think have been on people's peripheral vision for a very, very long time. But actually, you're bringing them in and bringing them in front and center, which I applaud and celebrate. So thank you, and best of luck with the cohort. And again, I know Jonathan will be putting links up and details of how to find you. Next question, really kind of classic podcast question, but along your journey, who or what has inspired you on your journey, Luke?
Oh, lots of people. So focusing in on, like, there's a practitioner side. I think it's worth calling out Perry Timms again, because actually he has been instrumental in my trajectory in this direction. Now, whilst I've found my own ways of working and thinking, and I'm starting to combine different principles into my own frameworks and structures, his challenge that most excited me around bringing agile into HR at the time. And of course, like I say, his thinking has evolved and he's doing amazing work. But Perry has to be called out, because he really set me along this journey, going to some of his early hackathons and experiencing iterative design in real time. He's got to be called out. More recently, I think people like Jeff Swan, of course, that we've already mentioned. There's been numerous people along my professional career that have mentored and supported me. So again, Kim Randers, who got a shout out earlier. There was Kirsten Ferber, who's Chief People Officer at Channel 4 now. She was Chief People Officer at BBC when she was my mentor. But there's been loads of people. And then my wife has to get a shout, like, genuinely, because she's the one, whenever I like doubting myself, she's like, no, like, you are doing everything you should be doing. And then final professional one would be Ruth Penfold Brown, who's become an amazing friend of mine, and again would be an amazing guest for you, David. But she's become an amazing friend of mine. But that relationship really was born out of her coaching me through a really difficult career transition, and that blossomed into a wonderful friendship. And now her and I support each other professionally on a sort of daily basis. So there's loads of people.
Brilliant. Well, we'll have we'll reach out to Ruth and see if she'd like to come and join us. But Luke, thank you so much. We'd love to, by way of a little token of our appreciation, make a small donation to a charity of your choice. So Jonathan will be in touch after the session ends today, Luke, just to find out who you'd like that to be, and we'll donate £100 to that charity. It's just by way of just a little thank you for giving your time up and sharing what I think has been an abundance of ideas and resources and support, and you've answered the questions that have come through from our viewers as well as from myself so fluently and so fully. Thank you. And Sarah, thank you. Wayne, thank you also for your lovely feedback in the chat function. I can see people have been really enjoying today's session. So you've been listening to Luke Omani from Sapient X as part of today's People and Culture Essentials videocast. I'd like to say thank you so much, Luke, for being part of the conversation. I'm really excited to get to know you. I can't wait perhaps to meet you for that cup of coffee as well.
That'd be great.
Whereabouts is home, actually, just out of curiosity? Where's home?
I'm back in Leicester now. So born and raised in
my old hometown.
Oh, is it really? Oh, there you go.
Yeah,
we should have started the conversation there.
Oh, we should have done. Yeah, I'm from Nottingham, and then I lived in Leicester for about 8 years before I moved to London. Yeah, well, yeah, I'm regularly back in. I lecture at De Mont.
My wife works at De Mont.
Oh, well, there you go. A whole nother. So, well, I mean, yeah, Leicester, I know and love very well. So, look forward to perhaps having that cup of coffee in my old hometown and meeting you properly as well as in the virtual world.
like I say, the best coffee shop around is literally 2 minutes around the corner from my house. So we're in prime position for that coffee when you're ready.
Luke, I'm on my way.
And shout anyone who's in Leicester, shout out to the Coffee Obsessive. Go and check it out. Amazing specialty
Coffee
coffee.
Obsessive in Leicester. There we go. We've done our bit. We'll go and we'll get there. Good. I've not come across them before, but no, I'd love to meet up, Luke. But in all seriousness, I think the work that you're doing at Sapien X sounds fantastic, and thank you for being so generous today in sharing all of that with us. Hope you have a fantastic weekend. Thank you, everybody, for dialing in today and being part of today's conversation. Obviously, if you're listening to it on demand, I hope that you've enjoyed today's video cast. Please do join the People and Culture Association. We can't work without you as our members. We're constantly welcoming new corporate members, organisations who are joining us up, and of course, individuals can become individual members. Please find out more at peopleprofessionals.org. The details are up on the screen there in front of you. And yeah, please become part of this growing and emerging community. And as you can hear from the work that we're doing and conversations that we're having with Luke and many others, it's just a fun, energetic, enjoyable space where we can explore some of the themes and topics that are so important to organizations right now. So from me to you, Luke, and to Jonathan Rodriguez, of course, the amazing People and Culture Association coordinator who makes all of this stuff happen. And so many of the questions that I've been asking today, Luke, are down to Jonathan's hard work and research before the session. So Jonathan, to you do an amazing job. You really do. So on behalf of all of the members at the PCA and myself and everyone, all of your colleagues, thank you for your work. So that's it. Thank you so much again. Yeah, thanks for joining us and being part of it. And Luke, enjoy your weekend in lovely Leicester.
Thank you, and pleasure and privilege. Thank you for having me.
You're very, very welcome. Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody. Cheerio.